I have a number of questions, but one is addressing your description of the development of the Israeli mental territory, the reducing of this territory, the narrowing down to this little rock. I would just love to hear from you if there is any kind of phases in development on the Palestinian view of this territory that you would be able to describe from your perspective, and where you would find yourself in that development.
I think that, I mean, without the precision that we heard just now of the evolution on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, I think that there was a major change that started taking place after '67. That until then, Palestinians were basically fighting for the land. It was land-centered. And the idea of fighting for the land was not really clear in people's minds. Actually, this is a very important, I think, issue. When your idea or your vision is not really very clear, and using the phrase to restore Palestine, what does it mean? And at one stage, I wrote an article in the local press before Twitter and all of these things, but to Palestinians, sort of challenging that idea. You know, what does it mean to restore or to go back? What does it mean? Is it something? Are you sort of searching for a journey into the past? Is that something that's possible? What is it exactly that you want? Even when you want to restore land, what is it that you want to restore? But anyway, this was a major defining ideology, the restoring of land. Until '67, with the '70s and '80s, I think something started happening on the Palestinian side, which was probably similar, analogous to what happened early with the Zionists and Ben Gurion, which is to start slowly giving more priority to national identity, to give that priority over territory. And so with the '70s and then the early '80s, and definitely by the end of the '80s and the first Intifada, there was a very clear period in which Palestinians basically put priority or gave priority to the concept of national identity over that of territory. So that, you know, Palestinians were prepared to make do with a state, and that is how they looked at their future, and that would have been enough alongside Israel. This was a kind of second phase. And then now, maybe after 20 years of Oslo and all of this, I think we're going back into a third phase. And the third phase is much more vague again and not clear. And it's sort of it's supported by sort of religious visions about the Muslim nation and about this and that. So we're now going into an area which is extremely unclear, very sort of vague. People talking about creating a Muslim state and so on. To go to the Aqsa and the mosque, I mean, I forgot to tell you that, you know, this is part of the conflictual situation, that my name, Sari, comes from the Arabic, which is the Quranic journey that is mentioned, made by the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. And I don't know, to Mecca to Jerusalem. I don't know how many of you know this, but the only miracle that Islam has, that we know, ascribed to the Prophet, because the Quran wasn't his miracle, but we assume, you know, he wasn't like other prophets who went around making a lot of miracles. So the only miracle really that's associated with Muhammad is this journey from Mecca to Jerusalem. And then from Jerusalem he goes up, you know, to God. Sort of like beam me up, you know, that kind of thing, beam up. So, and this is very important because in terms of you know, significance, religious significance, it means in this picture that it is from there, from the rock, that the Muslim can ascend to have a vision of God. You see, Gabriel, who is the messenger, who brings him the message from God, can come down to him in Mecca. But when he is called to go to God, to see him, he has to come to Jerusalem, and that's very important. And my name, Sari, is associated with this. This is part of the conflict and the contortion in my personality that actually also made me call one of my sons Burak. And Burak is the is the animal, is the Pegasus, kind of Pegasus with the wings. That in the you have it in the museum. There's a picture, a nice Persian drawing of Pegasus carrying the Prophet up to God. Now, why am I saying this? Because, in fact, you know, we talked about it, Avraham and myself, earlier, that, you know, if we had been Chinese and I don't know, Indians or Japanese, we wouldn't have a problem, the Jews and the Muslims, for instance, over this particular area, the rock or the mount. But the problem is that we claim or we compete over the very same spot. And it's a very important issue because it sort of goes very deep into people's identity, I think. The fact that Muslims see themselves as Muslims by seeing themselves as part or related to this area. And it's part of their association with their Jewish ancestry. I don't know if you know this, but I mean, the Prophet Muhammad, when he first started out, saw himself, like Jesus, saw himself as part of, as an extension of the Jewish religion. And the Jewish prophets, for him, were his, if you like, religious progenitors, until, you know, there was a problem with Mecca and Medina and politics, and so he changed. And so his coming to Jerusalem was in fact an assertion of this kind of relationship. Now imagine how rejected you as a Muslim might feel if the Jew that you came to in Jerusalem tells you that you have nothing to do with me or with us or with the gateway to God. So this is where the Aqsa thing takes significance. The surah in the Quran, which talks about the journey, is called, again connected with the name Sari, is called the chapter of Isra. And if you finish the word Isra, if you finish the word, it's actually Israel or El. And actually, if you go through the chapter, you'll see basically it's about that particular chapter about the Jews. And if you read the first sentence, which talks about the journey, it is mentioned that the Prophet was brought to visit the masjid, the Aqsa, Masjid al-Aqsa, the masjid. where he met the Jewish prophets. And the question you ask yourself immediately, well, you know, what masjid? Masjid is the word for the Muslim mosque. So, I mean, and it hadn't yet been built, right? So what masjid? And then masjid occurs again later in the same surah. And then again, it talks about the destruction of the temple in the same surah. So the masjid is used again as the Jewish temple. And in other places in the Quran, the word temple is used, another word for temple is used. But here in particular, the word masjid is used. So you can see how intricately interwoven the temple masjid are in the two psyches. And you know, if one wants to address all of that, it's going to be very hard to ideally one would be able to somehow, or maybe wait for God to send someone else, another prophet, who will tell us how to do it. But it needs to be done, namely to see how to put together the Jewish with the Muslim narratives. Ideally, you know, somehow you would bring them back together again by some reading or another. But in the meantime, you know, we need to solve the problem, the Israeli-Palestinian problem, and we can't really wait out to solve the religious problem before we do that. But anyway, so these are the three phases. We started out wanting the entire territory, then later there was the Palestinian state, the two-state solution, and then now finally we're going in the direction, it seems, more of radicalization, and the idea of we don't want a state, and people saying, no, we want a Muslim country or Muslim state throughout the country, or we don't want anything, and so it's a bit of a problem at the moment.
And there's one question that just connects with what you said now, because you said that, I mean, when in your childhood and your personal experience, which started after the partition of Jerusalem between Jordan and Israel, in East Jerusalem you had no chance to meet any Jew.
That's right.
But in your family, there must have been memoirs of times before when there was some kind of Arab Jewish and Muslim Jewish coexistence.
Are you fishing for something for the museum?
No, but I'm fishing in your family memoirs for what kind of image? I mean, apart from seeing, as you describe it in the essay for the catalog, actually, of the current exhibition, when you see these black creatures on the other side of the no man's territory, no man's land, but what kind of tales did exist, or did they exist in your family about Jews? Was there something that was talked about?
You know, I grew up believing that the Jews were the worst kinds of things you could ever come across or have anything to do with, because of the fact that my immediate family was very directly and specifically hurt by them, and all I could hear as I grew up. And as you heard before, my father was also in politics. My mother was a very active social person. All I grew up was an atmosphere in which their pains and their anger was being expressed against the Jews, and not in a Semitic way, anti-Semitic way, but in the enemies in that way. And nothing to do with religion, by the way. I mean, the religion is a recent thing now, but at the time it was much more, the Jews are the terrible guys that came and my grandfather was on my mother's side, had his property burned down. I'm not sure by some Jewish organization or by the British, but he was an activist, and he was one of the first people whom the British expelled from Palestine together with other Palestinian leaders who were resisting the Jewish presence, and they confiscated his place and so on. So, you know, the family went through what they considered to have been a painful experience. And so as I grew up, that's how I felt. My father, on the other hand, had very good relations with Israelis before 48. And, you know, because in Jerusalem, and he was a lawyer, he interacted with various people. And after 67, after the wall fell down, so to speak, suddenly the conversation changed. And suddenly my father would begin to welcome and meet and tell us about friends or acquaintances he used to know from the time before 48. And then he'd tell us, these are my friends from before, you know, various families. My mother constantly had a very negative view. She was tolerant of my father's, you know, Israeli colleagues and so on, but she was not into that at all. She sort of maintained a kind of solid position of, you know, I don't know about you, husband, you know, but I have a problem with them. You know, this is my mother's attitude. And one of the lawyers